Hello, it's late. Lately, I found myself in a bit of a rut with my photography. Now, I often go through phases of hating my photography, but this time it felt a little bit more acute than usual. My salvation came in the form of a friend of mine who decided to take me out to celebrate for a recent promotion, and we opted to do a photo walk afterwards. Now, she's a bit more new to photography, so during the course of that, we found ourselves sort of discussing the fundamentals and my philosophy around what I shoot and how I shoot it. And that ended up being pretty helpful for me in terms of changing the way I think about my current photography. And her penchant for black and white photography also kind of planted a seed in my head as well, I think. So when I found myself preparing for the California trip that I just took, I found myself reaching for that 23mm f2 and that 16mm f1.4. I really wanted to try and avoid my old safety blanket, the 35mm f1.4. When I got to San Diego, I decided to use that 16mm f1.4 as that sort of all-day walk-around sort of lens. That's not a roll that I've used it in before, but it ended up being pretty handy, I think. It's got a really close minimum focus distance, it's weather sealed, and it's just kind of fun to use. I'm not really used to shooting something that wide regularly, not without an explicit purpose at least, but I did end up liking it. I think I need more time with it. My photos that I shot, I guess, decently satisfied with. Wasn't anything too impressive though, I don't think. When I got to Santa Barbara, I decided to go with that 23mm f2. Now, that's a pretty comfortable focal length for me. When I shoot video, I use a 35mm on my full frame camera, like I am right at this moment. So that didn't feel like too much of a stretch for me, like compositionally speaking. The lens itself is a pretty handy little lens. It's pretty light, pretty compact, it's got great autofocus, and I think it just has a pretty good look overall. But the change of focal length wasn't the only thing that was different at this time. I also opted to shoot in black and white. I think when you're shooting black and white, it sort of naturally changes the way that you frame everything. You don't have color as a consideration, so you're focused purely on that exposure and the composition and not the sort of contrast that comes about from different colors. That was a big deal for me since the color is a big reason why I shoot Fuji in the first place. So abandoning that dimension altogether definitely forced me to think in some different ways. Black and white is not something I shoot with any sort of regularity, but in addition to the seed that had been planted earlier on in my life there, this kind of pivot towards black and white was inspired by another good friend of mine, Human Katuzi. Now, his work is pretty good, and I don't have anywhere near the mastery of composition and exposure that he has, but it was still a good exercise for me and something for me to sort of chase as I was, out and about taking random snaps. When I got to Pismo Beach, I opted to go directly for that 16mm again. I really liked the look of it the first time around, but yeah, wanted to try it in a new and different sort of situation. In addition to that, I did actually take off the glimmer glass filter that I normally keep glued to all my lenses. I was shooting with an ND filter that I had because I was doing some video as well. I can throw some of that video up. I mean, it's nothing super impressive. It's just something I wanted to play around with.
You got It's very Brechtian, very meta.
We're gonna have to piece all the...
As I was shooting this, I opted to keep my shutter speed locked most of the time and actually just changed my exposure largely with that ND filter. During my conversations with Human, we had talked about that shallow depth of field can be a bit of a crutch for newer photographers, and it's definitely something I've sort of fallen back into myself. I mean, I love the way bokeh looks. I love that dreamy sort of effect it gives everything, and I love the way it lets you isolate your subject. But a lot of street photography is pretty classically shot with like a zone focus sort of method, so deeper focus being a sort of a necessity there. But I thought it was a good stretch for me, and to try to focus on, well, everything being in focus and not allowing that shallow depth of field to give me a different feel or allow that to isolate my subject, and instead using light and composition to do that. Now, I think I'm a pretty competent photographer. I have a pretty decent grasp of the fundamentals, but I'm still not that talented overall. So I couldn't leave my safety blanket the entire trip. So as I got to the final leg of my trip with my friends over in Los Angeles, I opted to go back to that 35mm F1.4. It honestly felt great to go back to that focal length, that compression, that tight frame, and going back to color. It's a very comfortable, useful, well-known sort of spot for me to operate in. So I had a good time just walking around and snapping with that. My friends are pretty used to me always having a camera with me. At this point, they're probably going to end up some of the most photographed people in the world, and I hope they don't resent me too much for that. If there's anything to pull from this meandering mess of a story, it's that I will find any excuse to share the frames that I've stolen from the world around me. There's a more minor point to be had here. It's that it's good to try new things. Hobbies, I think, are a place for us to find comfort. It certainly served that purpose for me when it comes to photography. It's the way I sort of pull a bit of stillness from the chaotic world around me. Now that's all good and therapeutic or whatever, but I also need to remind myself to grow. I can't chase new perspectives from this comfortable rut I've worn down for myself. And photography is my biggest excuse to experience the world around me. Sometimes you just gotta remember to grab your camera, grab your lenses, and get out the door. Otherwise, you're never gonna see anything new. That's all I got. Bye.